Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this evening's screen talk in conjunction with the screening of Our Lucky Hours. My name is Eleanor Nairn. I'm a curator at the Barbican Art Gallery. I have worked for about 3 years now on an exhibition of Jean Dubuffet, which, fingers crossed, we're hoping will open in May, on the 17th of May, government restrictions allowing. So from the very outset of the Dubuffet project, it was clear that we wanted to tell the story of his collection de l'Art Brut. He was really passionate about thinking about artistic practice outside of professionalized circles of artists. And it's this work, as much as his own work, that remains a really important legacy from that time. So we went to go and see Sarah in Lausanne and spoke to her about this idea. Could we curate an exhibition within the exhibition, which has actually ended up being 2 exhibitions within the exhibition of 50 works by artists who were collected by Jean Dubuffet. And I think it will remain to be seen when you come and visit the show, but I think they are some of the most moving and inspiring aspects of the exhibition. So one of those artists who's in the downstairs space is an artist called Auguste Forestier, who was an artist who was working at Saint-Aubin, a psychiatric clinic that had a really extraordinary and progressive approach to thinking about care. And this film, Our Lucky Hours, which I think some of you will have had an opportunity to see, documents these different ways of approaching artistic practice and mental health. So to help us think through the significance of Auguste Forestier and his colleagues working in Saint-Aubin, we have 2 fantastic speakers this evening. I'll mention Sarah first, because I've already said she was really there from the beginning of the journey. So Sarah is the director of the Collection de l'Art Brut, where she's been since 2013. She has been, I think I can say, on behalf of lots of people, a really kind of transformative director of that institution, and has collaborated on an enormous number of international projects, exhibitions such as the Big Show at the Folk Art Museum in New York, also important publications like the Almanach de l'Art Brut, which was a project that Dubuffet had initiated himself in 1948. So I think the very fact that she's joining us this evening from Lausanne is indicative of the place that she's made for herself in these international conversations. And Ben, until very recently, worked at Headway East London, a charity that collaborates with survivors of brain injury on cultural and research projects. And he is the author of Tell Me the Planets, about stories of brain injury and what it means to survive. And they will have a discussion amongst themselves, a bit about the film, a bit about how we think about artistic practice today, what we might think Art Brut means. And they will be very happy to open up to questions. We have live captioning from Orla on this evening's event. If anything is unclear to you, feel free to write that in the private chat and we'll be happy to clarify. And of course, to answer any questions that you may have at the end. We plan for the conversation to last for around an hour, just so that nobody gets the dreaded digital fatigue. So I think I wanted to say just one thing before passing over to the 2 of them, which is just to say a personal note of thanks, because really both of them have in different ways helped to deepen my understanding of thinking about Art Brut, and indeed thinking about Dubuffet and his place in relation to contemporary artistic practice. So it's very nice to now be able to step back and listen to them speak with one another. So I'll pass over.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And hello, Sarah.
Hi.
Good evening. You're joining us from Lausanne, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Great. And I'm in Somerset.
1 hour more than you.
1 hour more, okay. So yeah, thanks so much to the Barbican and to Eleanor for inviting us to talk about this marvelous film, this merveilleux film. That's my French word for the evening. Probably the only one I will attempt So I'm gonna rely on you, Sarah, to help me with my French pronunciation. Okay. I guess Eleanor's asked me to sort of kick off with a question for you, and I suppose maybe for those who haven't watched the film yet, because we're not sure if some people will have seen the film, but not everybody. So maybe by way of helping kind of contextualize the conversation and saying something about the film, could you say when you watched it? We've both watched it over the last couple of days for the second time. What stood out to you? What kind of struck you about the film in this second watching?
I would say that what is very interesting when we look at the film is the fact that the filmmaker was able to find, when she went to the hospital, of course she worked with archives, she interviewed a lot of people who worked, of course, in this place, but making the film, suddenly she found somewhere in a room in the hospital, she found films. How do you say? You have to help me.
Archive footage. Yeah, just film reels.
Archive footage, and she told us that it changed completely her way to then keep on making the film, because she had a first idea of doing it, and then when she found this incredible material that you see in the movie, these images, of course black and white, but without any sound, where you see the patients making different activities, creative activities, but also social, working in the fields and so on. It changed completely the idea of the film, and I found these images very, very strong, because we could really not just have a story about Saint-Alban by someone else, but also see with our eyes how they were living, and this is really the best part of the film, I think.
I didn't realize that it was something she'd already started working on. Martine, have you met her? How did you know that? How did you discover that about the film?
I met her because she came to see us, of course, in Lausanne, because when she decided to make the film, she wanted also to shot some major works coming from Saint-Alban, like incredible wood sculptures made by Auguste Forestier, that are major pieces in our collection, of course, and also she wanted to film the wedding dress of Marguerite Sirvin, who was also one of the patients in Saint-Alban. And so it was very important for her to, of course, tell the story of the hospital, of the way the patients were living, of the heritage of Toscales, of his way of practicing psychiatry. And also she wanted to be able to film the artworks that that were produced in the hospital in their new context, which is now the museum, the Collection de l'Art, because of course all the works I'm telling about have been produced in the hospital by Forestier, Sirvin, who were both patients, and they have been made without thinking about producing a piece of art. They were just in the need of create things, but with no idea of making pieces of art. And then, when Dubuffet saw them, Dubuffet, of course, as everyone knows, is an official artist. So he saw these productions with the eyes of an artist. And for him, of course, they were no doubt, they were pieces of art. And then making them entering into his Collection de l'Art Brut, and then now in the museum, was also important for the filmmaker to show this new dimension, which is now really an artistic dimension. That case.
So I just shared, while you were talking, I shared one image of a sculpture by Auguste Forestier, who you mentioned, and I'm going to try and share another one by another of the artists, Marguerite Sirvin. I think Sirvin. You mentioned as well. which is on your own collection's website. I hope people can see that. So it's one of her. Is it lace making that she was doing at the hospital? Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So it's this incredibly beautiful, very, very beautiful dress that she made. Yeah. And that's in the film. So both of these pieces are referenced in the film, I think. There's the sculpture.
Yeah, exactly. They are major works of our collection. And the wedding dress came into the collection in the 60s. The pieces arrived in 63 in the collection when, Dubuffet started again to write to the doctors. We were practicing in Saint-Alban in the 60s when the collection de l'Art Brut of Dubuffet came back from New York, beginning of 62. He wanted to get to collect again, and so he decided to get in touch again with these doctors and managed to get this incredible piece of Marguerite Sirvin into the collection in 1963. And concerning the wood pieces of Auguste Forestier, they entered the first pieces which entered the collection arrived in 1948 and then 1949. When Dubuffet went to visit the Saint-Alban just after the war in 1945, he decided to go there to visit the hospital, and he wanted to see these pieces of Forestier that he had seen previously in some of his friends' house, like Picasso, for example, who had some pieces in his place, and Tristan Tzara too. And so he asked Toscales if he could go to Saint-Alban to see Forestier, to meet him, and to see some of his pieces, to be able, of course, to bring them back and to integrate them into his collection. And we know that he went for one day in Saint-Alban in 1945, but that he couldn't meet Forestier, and that he was not very welcomed, actually.
That's mentioned in the film, isn't it?
Yes,
I can read. It says, he says in a letter, the narrator reads out a letter from Dubuffet to Jean Houry, who was one of the hospital psychiatrists, saying that he knew that many of these other important people like Picasso owned examples of Forestier's work, and he lists several of these people: Tristan Tzara, Paul Eluard, the poet, and he says, but I'm disliked by these people, by many of these people, and when I visited the hospital, I was greeted rather coldly. And I wasn't allowed to meet Forestier, even though that's what I went there to do, and I couldn't buy any of his work. Can you say anything about why was it Dubuffet was disliked in this way, and why was he treated so coldly by the people at the hospital? Do you know what was going on there?
No, it's hard to say exactly why, because I didn't find many information about that. But the thing I read is that Toscales was seeing Dubuffet as a bit haunty and a bit like an aesthete, you know.
An aesthete, yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
So he didn't really like him so much, but at the same time, you know, he really managed to understand what Dubuffet wanted to do, and he collaborated, of course, because thanks to Toscales, Dubuffet has been able to create what we can call the core of our collection, which is the historical collection of Dubuffet, made with these incredible pieces of artworks, all coming from psychiatric hospitals, because the majority of the first discoveries of Dubuffet were made in psychiatric hospitals like Saint-Alban. So we can say that, although Toscales maybe didn't really like Dubuffet on a personal level, could understand his project, as the other doctors like Houry and Roger Gentil, who then arrived later on in Saint-Alban, and they were very close from Dubuffet. I mean, we have a big correspondence of letters between Dubuffet and Houry and then Gentil. whereas we have very few letters between Toscales and Dubuffet. But nevertheless, you know, he was understanding the project, and they really, and it's the doctors, we have to say, and I think it's important to say that the psychiatrists like them, and all these doctors, like also Dr. Marie in Villevrar, or in Switzerland, Morgenthaler. We can talk also about Hans Steck for Alois, and you know, many others have really played a key role in the creation of the collection, because they were able to keep the works made in the hospitals, and then to, of course, give them to Jean Dubuffet. But also, I think in the case of Saint Alban, we have to remember that Toscales and his team have been also able to offer the right conditions to the patients to create at a time where the workshops didn't exist at all in hospitals, at a time where, of course, ergotherapy didn't exist either. So they really managed to create a climate of liberty, and to let the patients create in a free way. And this is very special, and that's why we can now talk about these works and see them hopefully very soon at the Barbican exhibition.
Yeah, I'm going to share another image, Sarah, because I think it would be really great for us to help contextualize. Where is it then? This one. Yeah, so I'm sharing an image of Tosquelles, and just to make sure people understand, Tosquelles was one of the main psychiatrists at Saint-Alban, the hospital featured in the film. And he arrived, I think, in 1939 or 40. Is that 40. Right, Sarah?
40.
Yeah. And for context, one of the important things to know about Tosquelles is that he was a Catalan. He had been involved in the Spanish Civil War. He was a communist activist and militant, and he was very closely connected with the communist movement in Catalonia. And he was sentenced to death by Franco when the far right government took over in Spain, and he ended up in a refugee camp himself in the Pyrenees on the border between France and Spain. And he was sent for by the director of the hospital at the time, who I think was Balvet. Is that right?
Yes.
And so he came with this very radical politics, very, very strong left-wing politics. And maybe it's hard to know exactly how that relates to what we think of as left-wing politics today, or communism, but in the context of the war, this was a time when France was governed by the Vichy government, the occupation government, the Nazi occupation government. And Tosquelles arrived in this very rural place, this quite isolated place, to work at the hospital. And in this image, you can see him standing. It looks like he's standing on maybe a part of the roof, like a corrugated metal roof of the hospital. And he's got bare feet, and he's wearing like a work shirt or a t-shirt. He's got his hair sort of raked back from his face. He's wearing these kind of very round black spectacles. And above his head, he's holding this extraordinary wooden sculpture. It looks like a boat. It has like an anchor. It looks like an anchor dangling from one end. It has many, many masts. It has portholes all the way along. It's incredibly rich, huge, complicated wooden object that could be a very elaborate children's toy, or it could be some kind of device, a mechanical device or something. But what it is, and this is a piece of work made by Auguste Forestier, who had been at the hospital since 1914, I think, and had been gradually developing an art practice in that setting. So that that's kind of gives both context to both Tosquelles, the psychiatrist, and Forestier, the artist. Do you know much about Forestier's life before he came to the hospital and started making these sculptures? Do you have a story about him you can tell?
Well, not really. I think we know more about him when actually he was at the hospital, because he was very special in the sense that he really managed to make, let's say, his into the hospital is a little enterprise by collecting food that he would then sculpt, making these incredible objects. Mainly figurative objects, like fantastic animals. There is a very nice piece which will be shown in the exhibition, like a crocodile, kind of animals, fantastic between crocodile and an imaginary animal, but also boats and many soldiers. And what is interesting in his case is that we know that he was working. He had made a kind of workshop of his own, putting a table in one of the corridor of the hospital, and then he was working here. And also we know that very often he was taking his sculptures and getting out of the hospital and sending them to the people from the village, the farmers, and to make some money.
Yeah.
So that's why actually many of the people around were able to buy one of his sculptures. But what is interesting to underline again is the fact that all the team of the hospital, the doctors, and were letting him do what he wanted to do. He was completely free, and with this idea of freedom, I would like maybe to ask you, Ben, a question about your practice as an artist in the different workshops you worked for. And the question is, how can we manage to have, in the context of a workshop, which is a special frame, to keep this idea, which seems to be essential for the creation of these incredible works that we are just seeing, to keep the idea of freedom in the process of creation. And I think that sometimes it's a bit antinomic, and a contradiction. It can be a contradiction with this idea of a space, a workshop, and people, artists being here to explain and to teach to these patients. So can you tell us a bit about your own experience, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really interesting. It's something that, to me, in watching the film, particularly the second time, this really stood out to me, this question about freedom. And you used the word liberty while you were just talking now about Forestier having the liberty to work. And in the film, Jean-Louis, I think, is talking about Forestier, and he describes him as having a certain coefficient of liberty, having a quiet place where no one bothered him. He describes him as being protected by the sisterhood of nuns. He also says, and I think that to me is like, that's all very, very important. But I think it's really, there's some real subtleties in kind of what you're asking about the way these kind of environments can work, and maybe those subtleties don't entirely come across in the film, or maybe they're there, but you need to be looking for them or watching for them. Because for me, what's really freedom is at the center of this, and freedom of all kinds, because in my work, or in my approach to this, which honestly, it's very hands off. I wouldn't want to claim to be someone that has done anything, really anything more than create an environment. That's what I've tried to do. And with Headway East London, the studio there, which is called Submit to Love Studios, really my role most of all has been about finding some money for it, identifying space, and then encouraging people actually, including staff, you know, encouraging staff, encouraging volunteers, and encouraging the artists. And whenever I visit, you know, in all of the visits that I make, actually what I do is I look at the art and I get excited about it. And I think, I think you know, it's interesting that you use these accurate, I think, terms when it comes to the what we see in the film. You use the term patient to describe the people living there, but that's probably not a term that in my work I would ever use, because the people I've worked most with are people who are not in a clinical setting. They live in the community, and they're not generally receiving much in the way of medical treatment. So then, and they're certainly not my patients, because I'm not a clinician, and they're not patients of the organization that I've been working with. And actually what I've tried to encourage is to talk much more simply in terms of making an art, and to try to dissolve too much in the way of distinction between the professionals and the clients, or because in an artistic context, really there are no professionals and no clients. You know, if it's a group of people in a room making art, where is the profession? Where is the profession? You know, if anything, I suppose the most you can say about the professionals in that setting is that they are wonderful facilitators, right? They're very, very good at making people feel confident, and they're good at maintaining an environment where that freedom can flourish. I think there's something I wanted to mention was this. And going back to the picture of Toscaires standing on the roof in his bare feet, I wanted to mention this thing that Uri also says in the film. He says that Forestier was in a permanent struggle against shattering and destruction. He permanently remade the world. He was engaged in permanent remaking of the world. And he credits this idea of permanence to Toscaires. He says, Toscaires describe it as permanente, right? The condition that Forestier was in, this permanent remaking of the world. And Toscaires also is credited with this idea of permanent revolution. Have you heard of this?
What? Can you just
permanent? Yeah, permanent revolution. This is one of the ways he described the work at Saint-Alban.
Yeah. That's what the idea that, you know, he has to let's say leave things evolve and not trying to control them. That's right. The idea, I think, of his way of practicing psychiatry. Letting, you know, all the space and, as we said, all the freedom to the people there to be able to work, to create, and without fixing things. And I think this was very revolutionary at the time, and I would say even still today, because what is also interesting is the fact that the objective was not to make art and to make them create artistic things, you know. The idea was just to let them create, do what they wanted to do. And among all these patients, some of them managed to have their very individual and very strong artistic language. And some of them were actually artists, and more specifically self-taught artists. So that Dubuffet called then art brut artists. And what we see now is, of course, there is all this practice of workshops since, of course, a few years now in hospitals and different structures. And the idea is to offer a way for these persons to feel better through different activities, like, for example, painting or art. But what might be sometimes a bit problematic, in my opinion, is the fact that some of these places want to have the person you know, being there making art, you know, at any cost, and saying that this is art. and this might be a bit problematic in a sense. So can you tell us a bit about that? What is your feeling about this this kind of tendency in some places to not to be clear about, is it practicing art for, you know, offering people a kind of, you know, feeling of happiness and, you know, helping them to feel better, or is the aim, is the idea to produce art by you know, through these workshops? Because sometimes I have the feeling that the idea is really to create art and saying that this is art, and then, you know, wanting to make exhibitions and selling the pieces as art brut. So it might bring some confusion, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like you're talking about the difference between art as a therapeutic activity versus art as a commercial or I guess almost academic or you know, art as it's in terms of engaging with the art world, the fine art world. Is that right? Is that what you're
yes, and also the idea of having an intention to make them produce art and not just expressing themselves. For me, it's very different, you know, to create a space where persons with certain injuries can express themselves through art, but without any expectation of them making art, you know. And in the counterpart places where there is a kind of, you know, expectation of saying that this is art, you know, at any cost. So what do you think about that?
I mean, maybe it's hard for me to speak to that exactly, because I'm not sure I've encountered what it sounds like you're describing a very particular experience, you know, this encounter with one or other environment where this is happening, or is that, I'm not sure I've seen it so much.
No, maybe, you know, in different places like in Europe or in different workshops, you know, they want to make exhibitions and then they want to sell pieces, and then they you know, they tend to want to exhibit what is done, saying that this is art brut, because of course now art brut is something which is known by, you know, many people, and also because now art brut is has entered into the commercial scene. So, you know, you can sell pieces of art brut for a certain amount. So there is a kind of, I think, movement of confusion between these two. So I wanted to have your feeling about that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess probably in my work and in my life, I don't probably see it as my business or concern to make those kinds of distinctions. It's not something that comes up in, like, I probably don't really care whether something is or isn't art. That's not the most interesting thing to me. I'm excited when people make things, and I'm excited, you know, I'm more or less excited by some different thing, you know, different people's work or different parts of their work. You know, and that's because of who I am and where I've come from, and, you know, my personal, I guess, experiences. But I would say probably maybe a bit like Toscayes, or probably I'm a little bit more subversive in my tendencies. I'm not so interested in kind of establishment thinking. And like this picture of Toscayes holding the boat, I think says a lot about his approach and his interest in removing boundaries, right? As a practitioner. I mean, the fact that he's standing there, he's not in a white coat, right? He's not carrying a clipboard or a dossier. He's in his bare feet, right? He's standing on a roof. What is this guy doing? You know, and he looks mad. He looks like a slightly crazy person doing this. Okay, and I think this is illustrative of his approach, and what excites me about this film and about the work at Saint-Alban was really the political core, really what it was saying about people, about the people that were living in the hospital. And I guess the impulse on, particularly on Toscaya's part, to try to dissolve these ideas, these distinctions, these categories that separate people. I think there was something really. This goes back to this question of freedom, right? So I guess the question is, what is Toscaya's, when he talks about permanent revolution? What's the point of that revolution you're roaming around your house.
I'm sorry, really. I have to move, but because
It's
of
fine,
my
it's fine. I was just sort of ignoring it for a while, and then
yeah, I'm sorry.
I couldn't ignore it anymore.
No, that's
It's fine.
Yeah.
Are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Found a place. Found a
I
place.
had some problem with my battery. Sorry.
Oh, fine, no problem. So I guess what I'm saying is that I would like to talk about the term art brut. I think that's an important discussion, and we can come to that in just a second. But I think, in a way, I don't think that was the concern at Saint-Alban. I don't think that's what people were doing. As you say, it's not what they were interested in particularly, this idea of the art world and, you know, the role of people with psychiatric problems in the art world. And it's also not particularly my concern in my work either. And this photograph, I think, is really, really illustrative of what the concern is and where the art comes from. It's more like what's underneath the art, right? What's the basis for that to start happening? And I would say this idea of permanent revolution is important. So for me, I want to the kind of thinking goes like this: what is, you know, permanent revolution to what end? The end, the purpose of permanent revolution is freedom. Okay, so what is the purpose of art? Art to what end? And I would say that for me, and for perhaps Tosca, I hope, or you know, maybe I'm talking out of turn, but I think the purpose of art is also freedom. Right, in this context, but freedom from what? Okay, and for me the answer is freedom from power, from fascism, right? In particular, in the setting concerning Saint-Alban, when Tosquelles arrived in 1940, the primary concern actually for everyone involved was resistance to fascism, surviving fascism at that time, and I think Bonafé, right? He quotes Paul Eluard, the poet, in the film, talking about surrealism. He says that surrealism is the escape or the resistance to all that divides humanity. And I kind of want to say that's the same. It's all the same thing, right? The purpose of art in this context and the purpose of this permanent revolution is all the same thing. It's all about escaping, or it's resisting anything and everything that divides humanity. So I guess that's a very grand, maybe slightly complicated way of answering your question, but I guess that's what I'm interested in, and I think that's what art practice, whether or not the result is considered art, or whether it's art brut or anything else, regardless of the outcome. For me, art practice has that chance, creates that possibility of freedom from the categories that constrain us, whether that's being a patient, or being a sick person, or being mad, or being Jewish, or being any of these other things that fascism targeted directly, right? That's one of the things that art can do is create the prospect for freedom, and that's, you know, and that's very much still to me the relevance of it in recovery from illness or disability. Right, it's about escaping identities that are pressed upon you. And I don't know if that answers the question, but
and it's interesting what you say, because it's precisely what was Saint-Alban, in fact, a place of freedom, in terms of psychiatry. You know, they were practicing a completely new way of working with the patients. You know, Tosquelles founded the basis of institutional psychiatry, which said in a way that if you were just curing the person on a biological level, it was not enough. You had also to integrate to this biological treatment a way to integrate the person into society, and that was the big change in the way to take care of these patients. And so there was this idea of liberty to try new ways of curating these persons. So liberty in the practice of psychiatry, and also a big liberty in the process of create art, or not, but just create. So that's why Saint-Alban is for many reasons on an artistic level, but also I would say on a psychiatric level, a very interesting case.
I think it's captured at right at the end of the film. There's a narrator. I'm not sure of their name. I think it might have been one of the former employees, who says Saint Alban didn't cure them, the patients, the people they were working with, but at least for a while they enjoyed life.
Yeah.
And I guess I would want to say, he's almost saying, implicit in that comment is that there's this distinction between curing someone and happiness, that those are two different aims or two different outcomes. And I kind of want to say, based on my own work and my own experience, that happiness is the cure.
Yeah.
And because, I suppose my question would be, what else is it we're trying to cure if not unhappiness? Right? If a person is happy, whether they're mad or whatever, disabled, whatever it is, whatever a description the kind of establishment want to offer for that person's condition, they may have a disability or an illness, and that may not go away, but it ceases to matter if they're enjoying life. If I'm enjoying my life, I don't need a cure. I no longer need curing, right? There's no cure for dying. We're all going to die, right?
Yeah.
And I think anything else, I suppose what this made me think, again, going back to the context of the Vichy government, the occupation government, and this terrifying work that was happening across Europe, the work of fascism, actually any other desire, I don't know if this is right, but this is the thought that came to mind. Perhaps any other motivation around cure is a form of fascism, maybe what Foucault would call a form of fascism, in as much as if you want to go beyond supporting someone to live a happy life, if you still want to cure them of something after they're enjoying life, there's something wrong in your agenda. There's something that's a sinister agenda, because what you're doing is you're taking away from that person. If the person says, I'm happy, right? And you say, no, but you're still not cured. There's something sinister going on. And that's next door to fascism, isn't it? That's very close, because what you're saying is, I can tell you whether you're right or not, whether you're the right kind of human being or not. And that to me captures the agenda, I think, that was going on at that time and going forward, particularly under Tosquelles' work there. So maybe, I'm aware that we've been talking for about 40 minutes. I'm not, as far as I can tell, there haven't been any questions from the audience. Perhaps if someone at Barbican want to confirm that in the chat section, whether we should just carry on chatting or if there are questions that we need to answer. There are a couple. Okay, do you want to send them through and we can have a look? Okay, that's fine. So I think one of the things that I did want to get to with you, Sarah, was this question of the language of art brut, because I think for many people many English-speaking people, this idea, particularly the word brute, I guess you might translate that in a few different ways, and perhaps most commonly it's translated as perhaps the word raw art, is that right?
Yeah, literally, it would be raw art. Yes.
And actually, this is nice because this connects to one of the questions that's just come through. But it also, maybe just the sound of the word brute, it has the same word as brutal or brutish. It might sound to people like the association of primitive, right? And even the word raw also kind of links to ideas of primitivism or simplicity or less sophistication. So I wondered, maybe you can speak to that, but also this question from Chris Miller, who's in the audience, has asked, should there be a gallery of art brut in Britain? So maybe you can talk about both of those things. Should there be a gallery of art brut, and what would you call it if there was, and is that the right word?
Should there be a gallery? Indeed, since that there is no gallery so far in the UK, then What about the term? The term, yeah, indeed. If we translate it as literally, it would be raw art. And as you know, all the term has been invented by Jean Dubuffet in the summer of 1945, just after a trip he made in Switzerland, where he went to visit actually psychiatric hospitals and prisons because he was looking for anti-cultural production. And so his idea was to go into places which were at the time places the most being the most far away from the cultural world, which were at the time the hospitals. And so after this trip, he came with this term of art brut to define production made by self-taught people and made outside the official system of art. That's mainly the key words for his definition. And we know that in '72, when Roger Cardinal wrote his book about art brut, the title of the book was Outsider Art, published in '72 by Studio Vista, who was a house edition in London, actually. And from this time, the equivalent of the terminology in French for art brut has been outsider art. But the thing is that it doesn't mean exactly the same in the sense that outsider art means every kind of art which is outside the official system, which is not, let's say, into the system. So it might be, art brut, of course, productions, but also it included, and it still includes graffiti and tattoos, and all this underground culture that fits into this definition of outsider art. Whereas for Dubuffet, art brut production were something different, which was in connection really with the identity of the creator itself. It was not productions which were part of a more wider movement. For example, like graffiti, tattoos. There is a culture for that, and the people who make graffitis or tattoos are belonging to a group of persons. Whereas when we talk about art brut creators and productions, they are really the result of one singular identity and individual, who doesn't belong to a group. So this is the major difference, and of course the comprehension of the term in let's say in the French countries and also mainly in Europe is a bit different than in the US.
So we've had a couple of.
Then there is talking about England. There is a gallery connected to the collection of James Brett called the Museum of Everything. So James Brett, I think, is the most important art brut collector in the UK, and he has a very important collection with many pieces. Also many historical pieces that we have also at the Collection L'Art Brut, but also many new creators, art brut creators that practice today.
Yeah.
And
so
it's a private collection, and actually it doesn't have a fixed space where he shows the works. So he occasionally organizes temporary exhibitions in different countries where he can present many pieces of his collection. And then he has, in parallel to this place, he has a small gallery in London where he presents and sells different outsider artists as well. So maybe some people in the audience may know about the gallery of the Museum of Everything.
Yeah. So just to give a couple of other audience members a chance to get in, John Hill says, art is to stop us dying from the truth and from the Barbican. I'm not entirely sure what he means, but I like it. We've also got a question from James Paddock, who says, why are we still repressed? And this is an enormous question. And I assume it's related to perhaps what I was saying about freedom, I guess. And I don't know if we have time to address such an enormous question in our session here. I guess
maybe Eleanor, the curator of the show at the Barbican, could answer maybe to the question of John Hill, maybe.
Stalling.
Yeah, it's less of a question, more of a statement.
I was installing in the Barbican today and still continue after 6 years to get lost. So I also need art to prevent me from dying in the Barbican. It's the cheese at the end of my little mouse labyrinth. I think in ways these are really interesting questions, and I think, Sarah, you did a noble job of trying to answer really what is the kind of perversity around the orthodoxies that have come to restrict the supposed freedoms of Art Brut. So this is the kind of ways in which Dubuffet tied himself in knots with these questions, how he defined Art Brut when he coins the phrase in 1945 is not how he defines Art Brut when he makes the great donation to your museum in Lausanne. And it's maybe not quite how we think about it now. So there's something prickly about that, about it being a very complicated terminology, but there's also something I really like about that too, that it is an organic concept and it's not something that is easy to handle. And I think my answer to Chris in a way would be that maybe we don't need so much a gallery of Art Brut as our existing galleries to think more expansively about what art is and what it means and who we allow or entitle to make it. I certainly feel that two of the most profound experiences of art I have ever had were in Heidelberg at the Prinzhorn collection, and then with Sarah in Lausanne. Mm-hmm. And I came to, Dubuffet is a great writer amongst other things. And if you are curious to kind of hear more about what he had to say himself about Art Brut, I would encourage people to read. But one of his great comments was that he felt that the so-called professional artists were lacking in vitamins, that they felt like they were asleep in their chairs, if not dead, which feels like it speaks to John Hill's comment, that for him, that's exactly what Art Brut did. It was there to prevent people from dying, himself included. And I would certainly like to see museums and galleries showing us more vitamin-packed art in their exhibitions. Whether or not our show will do that, you're going to have to come and see for yourself, John Hill. And I think, James Paddock, you're going to need to come and see the degrees of repression that are present or not present. I mean, I'm going to say graphic design alone, it's not a good story. But whether we can get into the full Freudian implications of that question now, I don't know whether we can.
Yeah, but maybe can I just add something about this question and your comment, Eleanor? I would say that I think that there is no more need to have a dedicated gallery or museum for Art Brut in the UK, for example. I think that there is one, which is the Collection de l'Art Brut in Lausanne, and it's of course the main house, because we have the historical collection made by Jean Dubuffet, and so we have to take care of this work, to show them to the public, to teach about Art Brut, and this is the role of our place. But I think that today, of course, the context is very much different than in 1945 and even in 1976 when the museum opened in Lausanne, in the sense that now I think that most of the people recognize that the productions of our art brut creators, which means productions made by self-taught people creating completely outside the official system, are pieces of art, and this is accepted by almost everyone now. There are galleries selling art brut. There are art fairs where you can buy art. There are big, let's say, Sotheby's, Christie's, houses like that who sell art brut for a long time now. So the recognition of these productions as art is okay now. So I think that we don't need any more other spaces just dedicated to art brut, because there is no need now.
It risks a ghetto.
The main idea would be now to show art brut, in different places, like at the Barbican. You are not a place specifically dedicated to art brut, and I think that it's fine that now, in this actual context, we can show art brut everywhere and not specifically in spaces dedicated to art brut. So I think there would be no need to have a dedicated space for that in UK, but that we have to show more art brut in different exhibitions and in different museums, and that is fine.
There's also another interesting question that's just come in here, which is saying it always seemed to me that the fact that Dubuffet could decide, in inverted commas, whether the works by these people were art or not, and that he was envious of what he perceived as their naivety. So it is a really important question about, and it's one we kind of, I don't know that we grapple with so much as just try and convey in its unresolved state at the Barbican, that what gave Dubuffet the authority to make these decisions. And it for me, it rings, I think, back to, the image of the child with their stamp collection and being the kind of fervor with which they might invent their own taxonomies or their own categories of which stamps can go on which page. There is a certain zeal which we recognize in collectors, which is complicated for those who find themselves in that collection. And indeed, some of the most interesting correspondence with Dubuffet is with someone like Gaston Chessac, the artist who he had a huge protracted correspondence with, very, very turbulent, about questions of how he felt to be classified by Dubuffet in this way. And the one thing, I'm sure Sarah will have something to say on this, and Ben may have reflections too, but I guess the one thing that I did find moving, I find very interesting about Dubuffet across the board, is he does have flexibility. So the very fact that, I was hanging, for instance, today, an extraordinary painting that he made at the age of 83, which he showed in the Venice Biennale in the French Pavilion. He was making new work right up until literally the last days of his life. And in the same way, he was rethinking concepts like art brut. So the word that you mentioned of naivety is an important one. And later in his life, he was sort of shifted his position and recognized the degree of romanticism, that no one can work in isolation, that this image that he'd had, Sarah's conveyed this image of the maverick, of somebody working totally outside of the conditions of culture. That's what he was really interested in. What happens if you strip away the conditioning of culture? And later he realized that maybe none of us have that innocence.
But I think that this is even normal, because it was at the time, of course, he had to create this terminology of art brut. So create a concept. It was a concept in itself, to define a different category of art production. And so to define this concept, he needed to be a bit extreme in a sense, So it was, I think, at the time necessary to be so extreme in his ideas and definition. For example, when he made this exhibition in 1949, the first exhibition at the Galerie Rouen, not in the foyer downstairs, but in the main gallery, which was Place Vendôme. The title of the exhibition was Art Brut preferred to cultural arts. So he has been during all his life very extreme in his talks and in his ideas, but I think it was in a way a kind of necessity to mark really clearly the borders, between official art and art brut, which was supposed to be on the opposite side, let's say. I don't know, Ben, what you think about?
I guess I don't know as much about Dubuffet, and I don't know so much about his intentions or his kind of motivations. But I suspect, from what I understand, they were rooted in a kind of a subversive impulse, a desire to kind of shake up the art world and to shake up the establishment. And that's something I understand and I relate to, and I think a lot of people can feel excited about. And again, what's interesting, it goes back to this where we started, which was why did Tosquelles, why didn't he like Dubuffet? Because actually they were both subversives. They were both people quite committed to an agenda of disrupting and undermining establishment perceptions. And that's kind of, I think that's what in the film, Tosquelles in particular emerges as the subversive. He talks about subverting the rationing system of the Vichy government by diagnosing patients with TB when they didn't have TB, just so they could get an extra ration card. And at one point, he also, elsewhere, not in the film, he in talking about art brut, he credits Forestier. He says, "Oh, actually, even before Dubuffet came to visit, Forestier had invented art brut already."
Yeah, that's
and
right.
so even he wants to subvert the subversive here. So it's almost a competition between these two men who can be more subversive. But I think there's something really important about that. He's subverting anything that these people are confronted by that tries to tell them how reality works. They both want to shake. They want to kick against that. They want to prove it wrong, or create a new category, continually creating a new category. But again, this permanent revolution idea that disrupts that. And as much as the hospital, this is kind of, I'll stop after this. My kind of final thought maybe is that, remember that moment where we talked about Forestier having a protected space, a kind of safe space in this little corridor in the hospital where the nuns were like, "No, don't bother him, leave him alone. He's doing his work. It's important." They protected him to do this work of continual remaking the world permanently again and again. And in the same way, the hospital provided Tosquelles with a protected environment to do the work of disruption. Actually, as much as anything, what he was disrupting was psychiatry. He was subverting the ideas about what psychiatry was. So you've got this dyad. You've got Tosquelles creating an environment where this vulnerable person is protected to rebuild and build and make a world. And Tosquelles himself is protected to disrupt and undermine the establishment around that would try to prevent that person making their work. And it's this wonderful yin-yang, this wonderful kind of dialectic that you see happening. That's it. That's all I've got.
So I think basically, if anybody on this event has not so far seen Our Lucky Hours, there is no possibility that after hearing that description, they're not going to want to do that. It is a remarkable film. And I think, as Sarah said, for the archival footage alone to be able, and actually the filmmaker does a wonderful job of actually not interfering too heavily in the power and eloquence of that footage to kind of speak for itself. So I'd like to say thank you to Ben and Sarah for leading that discussion and allowing us to really begin an exploration. Actually, we are because of the strange peculiarities of this year, a couple of months away from an exhibition that we thought was going to open a month ago. Time has marbled, but the benefit of that is it gives all of us a bit more time to just keep probing these questions. And I think the conversations continue. So we're doing events of this kind every week or every fortnight on Thursday evenings. They're all free. Come back and join us. We'll have lots of practicing artists weighing in about what Dubuffet and what the Art Brut artists mean to them. And I suppose I'd just end with the lines that Ben had about escaping from all that divides humanity, because I think if there's inspiration that we need to draw from these artists, it's that. So I hope you will have a chance to come and see the works in the flesh. And for anyone who isn't able to travel immediately, we will have digital walkthroughs of the exhibition and other ways to be able to experience it. But thank you, Ben. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.